Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Home in Progress by RepcoLite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And before I jump into the show this week, I want to take care of just a little bit of business. A few weeks ago, I aired a segment that I recorded about hurting myself while grating cheese. Basically, I grated my knuckles. Anyway, a listener heard all of that and reached out with a link to an amazing Rotary shredder. It was going to eliminate all my injuries and have me shredding cheese with no concerns. I was pumped about it, so I told you about that 2 weeks ago. But in the midst of telling you about that, I added this little caveat, almost prophetically. Who knows? Maybe I'll be finger-free next week, and I'll tell you about the mishap that happened. Well, I'm not exactly finger-free, but boy, oh boy, did I ever cut myself on this new shredder. I used a slicer attachment, and I was happily slicing up vegetables, and then like an idiot, I reached into the little cone where the blades are, to scoop out the slices that hadn't fallen into my bowl, and I dragged my finger over the razor-sharp blades. I'd used the thing for a total of like 4 minutes, and I was already running around the kitchen looking for Band-Aids. The kids have officially just taken over all the cheese grating work at the house. I'm not allowed to touch any of it. Anyway, I told you I'd come back if I had a mishap and tell you about it, and I wanted to make good on that. All right, let's get to the show. And for the last few weeks, we've been talking about what your brain actually wants, from the spaces that you live in, the spaces that we move through. And in all of that time, we've covered things like coherence, which is basically the common thread that ties a home together. We've talked about variation, the contrast that keeps a space from being, flat or boring. We talked about lighting, how it regulates your body chemistry every hour of the day. And last week I ran a rerun. The week before, we talked about biophilic design, the natural elements that signal safety and calm to your nervous system, right? Natural elements signaling safety and calm. We talked about all of that. Today we're wrapping everything up, and I want to end where most design conversations usually begin, because I kind of like to do things backwards. It's kind of how I roll. So we're going to end by talking about paint color. But I want to have kind of a, somewhat different sort of conversation about paint color than you've probably had before. At least this is not going to be exactly like other conversations that we've had, or maybe that you've read about or listened to, online or whatever. Anyway, most of the conversations that we have about color are about preference. What do you like? What's trending? What looks good with your furniture? And those aren't bad questions. Those are important questions. But they're missing something. They're missing the fact that color, it's not just a matter of taste. Like all of the other things that we talked about in this little, whatever it is, little series, I guess, it's also a matter of biology. The color on your walls is producing measurable physiological responses in your body right now. Not metaphorically, not as a mood descriptor, but measurably, in your heart rate, your blood pressure, your cortisol levels, your stress level, your level of alertness or your calm. There's a pathway in your eye that sends signals directly to the hypothalamus. That's the part of your brain, for those of you who are not up on all the neuroscience that I'm really, really comfortable talking about. The hypothalamus is the part of our brain that controls the heart rate, your stress hormones. I got all hung up. I'm sorry. I'm stumbling because hypothalamus, for some reason, instantly when I said that word, the song, I Want a Hippopotamus for Christmas, went through my mind. And there's no connection. I mean, slight, hypothalamus, hippopotamus. I am so sorry. I don't know what I've got, but I've got something wrong with me that should be medicated. Anyway, the hypothalamus, it's part of your brain that controls your heart rate, your stress hormones, your sleep cycle. It doesn't form images. It just reads the environment and then adjusts your body accordingly. And color is one of the many things that it's reading. So when you walk into a room and you immediately feel something calm, energized, maybe a little anxious, maybe deeply relaxed, that's not your imagination. That's not just a good color scheme or good decor or good decorating. That's your hypothalamus getting a report, and your body is responding to the info that it's finding. Okay, maybe that sounds a little bit strange. I don't know. Maybe it sounds like a big stretch to think that color's doing all of that. If you're tempted to think that way, though, just look at all the people, the professionals, professional people. These are people who went to school for this stuff, so that means something, right? Look at all the professional people who use color around the world to set a tone and create a feeling. Filmmakers, for example, they go through incredible amounts of work to find the perfect colors to set a mood before a character even says a word, on screen. Hospitals, they think about color because they know that a room can either raise the temperature emotionally or bring it down, amp us up or calm us down. Restaurants, app designers, car companies, sports teams. Think about that. Sports teams, they're choosing colors with intention because they're trying to create an emotion. Retailers do it. Product packaging people, all of these people pay close attention to color. And they do that because all of those people are trying to shape a feeling before a single word is spoken. And that alone ought to tell us something. Color may not do all the work, but it absolutely helps push us in a direction. And that matters at home as well. Of course it does. Because our house, your house, my house, all of our houses are telling a story and setting a tone, whether we mean them to or not. Think about that. Whether you've done this intentionally, and created some kind of narrative for your house to say or a tone that your house is setting, if you did that intentionally or not, it's still doing it regardless. It's just happening. The colors in the room, they can help it feel calm. They can help it feel lively, serious, cozy, sharp, cheerful, restful, or maybe just a little off, like that one ant that we've all got. So with that said, color is really playing a role in your home and in your design and in what your home is saying. With all of that said, let's look into it and let's dig into what the research actually shows about what colors are doing to us. I just said they are, but let's talk about the research. Love digging into the science here. But before I do that, before I get into specific colors and the research, I want to take just a minute to make sure that we're all talking about color in the same way. Because when most people think about color, they're really usually only thinking about one dimension of it. And there are actually three, or at least three, that I'm going to talk about. The first dimension of color that I want to talk about is hue. Hue. That sounds weird when I say it. That's why I'm laughing. Hue. If I had a co-host with me, I'd say, did I say that right? And she would probably say, yeah, you did. You nailed it. But hue. Hue is the first one. That's the color itself, the thing that you're naming when you say this is blue or this is green. Hue is just the identity of the color. So that's hue. The second dimension is brightness, how light or dark it is. A pale sky blue and a deep navy, they're the same hue. They're blue, but they're very different in brightness. And the third dimension that we want to talk about, this is the one that most people really don't think that much about. It's saturation. Saturation is how pure or vivid the color is. How much of the actual color is in it versus how much white or gray has been mixed in. A fire engine red and a soft, dusty rose, they're both reds. The same hue. But the fire engine red is highly saturated, it's vivid, it's intense, it's pure, pure red. The rose is desaturated, it's muted, it's quieted down, it's softer. And your nervous system responds to those two versions of the same color in completely different ways. Okay, with that out of the way, let's look at the research and let's start with red. Red is the most physiologically activating color. Exposure to red environments stimulates your autonomic, oh my goodness, how do I say that word? Autonomic, I'm going to Google it a minute. Autonomic pronunciation. I don't know if you can hear this or not, but we're going to just roll with it.
Autonomic.
There we go. I should have looked that up ahead of time. I did not. Exposure to red environments stimulates your
autonomic
nervous system. And that's really just the part of your body that controls involuntary responses like heart rate and sweating. Yeah, sweating. Sometimes my
autonomic
nervous system is cranking out, working overtime when it comes to sweating. Sometimes I just think about moving and I start sweating. I don't know if that's a problem, if that's something medically I should look into, but I'm kind of I've gotten used to it. I bring a change of clothes with me wherever I go. Anyway, studies confirm that red increases our heart rate and our skin conductivity. Essentially, red tends to put our bodies into a more alert, energized state. And that sounds, it sounds bad, but it's not a bad thing. Depending on the room, that might actually be what you exactly want to happen in there. A dining room with some warm red in it can feel lively and social. For example, a kitchen with red accents has energy and appetite-stimulating qualities, which is why so many restaurant brands use red in their marketing, in their interior design, all of that. But a bedroom with red walls, your nervous system is going to have a harder time winding down in there. Not impossible, but it is going to be a little harder. Now, blue does the opposite. It measurably reduces your heart rate and your blood pressure. In one particular controlled experiment, participants who recovered from stress under blue lighting relaxed faster, and 83% of them said they felt more relaxed under the blue light compared to conventional white. The relaxation effect appears to be about emotional recovery rather than sedation. And what that just means, all of that just means, is that your body is calming, but it's not about falling asleep or, becoming unaware or, you don't care about what's going on around you. Your mind is actually staying relatively sharp. Your body's just calming down. So that's blue. And that makes blue genuinely interesting for a home office. You want to be calm in there, not anxious or overstimulated, but you also want to be alert, right? Thinking clearly when you're making your big deals, when you're on your phone with your boss, when you're copying and pasting from ChatGPT into whatever work document you're sending, you want to make sure you take out the little parts where ChatGPT says, here's what I think, or let me sum that up for you. You want to be alert so you can weed all of that stuff out and look like the professional you're pretending to be. And blue might help you do that. Green, that's a color that has the strongest evidence for stress reduction, of all the different colors. A study measuring cortisol, which is the stress hormone, found that walking through a green, nature-filled environment reduced cortisol by 53% on average. Just walking through it reduced cortisol by 53%. Green also shows strong associations with improved mood and energy. And the people in green spaces or, with a lot of green around them, they're not just less stressed, they're more emotionally balanced. It really helps in a lot of regards. Now, I want to add something here that most color conversations completely skip over, and I think it's actually the most practically useful thing in this whole segment. The color, the hue itself, whether it's blue or green or warm, taupe, or whatever, is only part of what your nervous system is responding to. A second part is saturation, and we're going to talk about all of the impact that has right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. People often think of paint as just another line item on the project supply list. But here's the thing. Everything you do, every hour of prep, every stroke of the brush, all comes down to the quality of the paint. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress by RepcoLite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And we're doing a deep dive into color psychology. We've talked about it in the past. You can't be a paint store podcast without talking about color psychology. And we've done that multiple times. But this time we're digging a little deeper. And our goal this time, my goal, is to help you see all the things that color is doing behind the scenes. How our brains and our nervous systems are reading certain colors and what responses those colors are producing, even if those responses are under the radar, kind of in our subconscious. We may not know that this is happening, but it is happening, behind the scenes. Now, last segment, we were talking about the basics, basics of color psychology, how red energizes, how blues and greens calm us down, and so on. But we ended last segment saying that the hue of the color, the identity of the color, whether we would say it's blue or red or green, the hue of the color is only part of the equation. The saturation of the color is also important. And just a quick reminder, the saturation is talking about how intense a color is, how vivid, how much gray or white is mixed into it, or how much gray and white is left out of it, kind of. The brighter, the more saturated a color is, the less gray or white is in it. Anyway, the research on this one is really clear, and it's really not surprising. But saturated, vivid colors produce stronger responses. Of course they do. A bold, saturated red physically excites the nervous system more than a pale, desaturated version of the same hue. We said that already. That's not surprising. But what about a saturated green or a saturated blue? Here's where it's a little more interesting. What effect does saturation have on colors that tend to make us more calm and relaxed? Is saturation just like increasing the natural power? It's like some kind of superhero mechanism. It's going to increase the natural power of the color. If green makes you relaxed, saturated green is going to make you super relaxed. Is that how it works? I wish that was how it worked, but it's not how it works. I think the best way to think about saturation and what it's doing is to think of it as a volume knob, and turning the volume up on any color, even a calming one, eventually overrides the calming properties of the hue itself. So a muted sage green is calming. A vivid, highly saturated Kelly green is visually exciting. It's physiologically activating. Both are green, but they're doing different things to your body. So it's not just enough to choose the right hue, you've also got to choose the saturation of that hue, the right volume for your color. But that's not all. It's even more complicated than that. There's a third dimension of color we talked about, the brightness, how dark or light it is, of course. And that also needs to be considered because that has its own effect on what it produces in us. And this is really interesting. Of all of them, this one's probably the most interesting, partly because the research is a little bit counterintuitive. Most of us, I think, would assume that the relationship between brightness and relaxation is pretty simple. Darker colors equal calmer settings, right? Turn the lights down, we'll feel more relaxed. That makes sense, to me at least. But it's not the whole story. Here's what the research actually shows. Very bright environments are activating. That makes sense. That's not a big jump there. Bright light is a daytime signal. It keeps us alert. But here's the counterintuitive part. Very dark rooms also produce a kind of activation, kind of a sneaky, beneath the surface kind of activation. When researchers measured heart rate in rooms of different brightness levels, they found that dark rooms produced higher physiological activation, which is just a fancy way of saying more stress than medium brightness rooms. And the reason seems to be something really, really old and really automatic in our nervous system. Darkness makes it harder for our brain to fully read the environment, to assess what's there, where things are, whether everything is safe. And so it stays slightly on alert. Not anxious necessarily, not stressed in an obvious way, but not fully settled either. There's kind of this low hum of vigilance running underneath the cozy feeling. An interesting study supported this by showing that people actually displayed a stronger startle reflex in dark environments. And this happens because of all the things we just said. In those darker environments, even when we consciously feel calm, our brain is running a background process. It's checking, it's staying ready, it's always on the alert. Even if it's just in the background and the slightest little thing can produce a response in us. So overall, the picture for brightness looks like this. Very bright, activating. That's good for daytime function, not great for winding down. Very dark can feel cozy on the surface, but it produces its own kind of sneaky, nervous system vigilance underneath that kind of keeps us a little bit wired. Medium brightness, Goldilocks brightness, particularly with warm light, is where your nervous system lands most comfortably. It's bright enough for the brain to feel oriented and safe, warm enough to signal evening, and rest, and all of those good things, and it's dim enough to not be stimulating. Now, all of that, everything we just went through, demonstrates how there are a ton of different things to consider when choosing your color. If you weren't nervous about picking colors before, you're probably freaked out a little bit now. There's a lot going on. The hue, the saturation, the brightness. You got to get it all right because they all play a role. Well, what does that look like practically in our homes? How do we get it right? Well, let's talk about that. Let's give some examples and make you feel comfortable with it. And let's do it right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Think about it. You spend hours prepping, sanding, taping, and then finally painting. Don't throw all that work away with an inferior product. The paint isn't just another supply. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress by RepcoLite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And we're talking about color psychology, the effect that color has on us as we use it in our homes, in our businesses, and in pretty much any way that you possibly can use color. And like I said, I've talked about color psychology so many times before. And I usually admit when I do that I get it. I get it. It makes sense. I accept it. I will let it go. I will accept it as established truth. But part of me, usually thinks it's a bit much. But this deep dive into it, this particular one, has finally connected all the dots for me. And that's how I work. I usually need a lot of little things to fall into place, and finally all the dots connect. And the people around me breathe a sigh of relief because now I finally understand it. It takes way longer for me than other people. Anyway, we're not saying that just because you painted a room red means you're going to feel that energy every time you walk in. That's what I was expecting. I'd walk into red rooms and I didn't feel this urge to fight or flight. Not more than normal anyway. And I was thinking this whole color psychology thing, it's pretty weak. No, see, it's not going to produce those kind of results. Thank goodness it doesn't. Thank goodness that's not how it works. What we're saying is that red is literally going to do something to you biologically. When you experience red, or whatever color, but red for this example, when you experience red, in a space, it's going to do something biologically. You can't control that. It's going to cause this reaction in your brain, and you may not consciously feel it. You can't stop it. You can't start it, but it's there. It's doing something to you. And that's going to affect your overall comfort and peace or energy and alertness in a given space. How much is it going to affect you? That's impossible to say. At least for me. It's impossible for me to say that. But it will have an effect, even if it's just beneath the surface. That's the thing that finally connected, and now it all makes sense, and I can accept it wholeheartedly. And all the interior designers everywhere around the world breathe a sigh of relief because I am on their team now. I'm all in on this. So the main point that I've been trying to make in all of this, this conversation, as well as all the conversations I've had over the last, 2 or 3 weeks about this concept, the main point I'm trying to make is that our brains and our nervous system responds to the spaces around us automatically, right? We don't choose it. We don't flip it on and off. It just happens. And since those responses can affect whether a room feels calm or tense, restful or stimulating, I think it's really worth paying attention to. Because if we're not paying attention to it, it's entirely possible that we're creating spaces in our homes that look beautiful maybe, but still are working against the atmosphere that we're trying to build. What we're trying to create in that room. Now, what I want to talk about in the last little bit here is going to be some practical color guidance, based on various rooms of the home and all of that, and how you go about picking colors and what you might look for. But before I get to all of that, there is something that you need to know, and you need to decide this before you pick any colors for any space. It's really something that you need to do before you make any design decisions for your home or your business at all. What is this one thing you need to do before you do anything else? I've talked about it on the show before. Haley has come back and talked about it recently, I think. But you've got to decide what feeling you want to create in a given space. That's the very first thing you need to figure out. What kind of feeling are you trying to create in a given space? Don't start thinking, I like greens, so when I paint that room, let's pick some, greens. I'm going to go get some colored chips. Don't start there. Instead, you want to think about what room you're working on, and you want to try to pin down what you think you want out of that room. And this is a little bit nebulous, but there's a thought train to get on board and just kind of ride for a while. Think about, what do you want out of that room? What are you going to do most often when you're in that room? What's the purpose of the room? What do you want to feel when you walk into it? What do you want guests to feel when they come in? If you're one of those people who has guests over, some of us don't. If you are, what do you want your guests to feel? Do you want the room to be a lively place for conversation and entertaining and things like that? Or are you looking for a place to settle down with a book at the end of the day? I firmly believe that this is a part of the conversation, the color decision, whatever you want to call that. It's a part of that process that we completely forget about. I'm in this business, and I think about this stuff almost all the time. And I forget about it. When I did my living room, I have talked about my living room ad nauseum. It was the room with the peeling paint, and I finally got that fixed. And then I picked a color, and I was agonizing over the color. And what I agonized over is what color is going to look good in there. It's, an Eastern exposure. So what color do I pick? I had so many things in my mind. What is the couch? What are the things that I'm keeping? I did radio segments on it where I talked about, how to work around stuff that you're not getting rid of, and how to look at certain things and realize, okay, this couch has to go. It's old, and don't make my color, don't choose my color based on an old couch. I could go on and on. I hope you get what I'm saying. I put all kinds of thought into choosing this color. What I didn't think about is what I want to feel when I'm in that space. And what I want to feel when I do think about it is calm and relaxation and peace and comfort and all of those things. That's what we wanted out of that space, most of all. And what we chose was kind of not bright, I shouldn't say it that way, a really warm yellow that just lights up the place in the morning with the Eastern, light coming in. It's wonderful. It's so inviting. It's energizing. It wakes you up, gets you moving. It is not what I want at the end of the day. It's just not working for me, and I'm going to have to repaint it. So I do this stuff all the time, and I don't think about, first and foremost, what I want out of that space, what I want to feel in that space. That is the first thing you've got to do, because you can pick all the right colors, beautiful colors, and put a beautiful color scheme together. But if they're not, color psychology-wise, working towards the feeling or the atmosphere that you hope to create, you're not going to end up getting there. You're going to do what I did, get a great color on the wall, put all the time and energy and money into it, and still not really enjoy that space. So give it some thought. Focus on it. That's the very first thing you should be doing anytime you're doing, pretty much any kind of interior design work in the home. Figure out what atmosphere you're trying to create. What is the feeling you're trying to get out of this space? Think about that. All right, that's the first thing. Now let's get more practical and look at a few different rooms of the home, and I'll show you what I'm talking about and how to do it all, and I'll kind of pull all of this together. But let's do that right after this. You're listening to Home in Progress, where the projects are real, the mistakes, they're educational, sometimes painful, mostly educational, and the only thing more stubborn than that old wallpaper on your bathroom wall is your determination to get it fixed. Proudly sponsored by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Paint with a purpose, people who care, and everything you need to get the job done right. Welcome back. You're listening to Home in Progress, brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. And I want to wrap up this whole color conversation so you can get on with the rest of your day. I mean, I got things to do too. So we're going to wrap this up so we can get out of here and start working. I'm hoping in this last segment to take all the things that I've kind of talked about throughout the earlier parts of the show and tie everything together here so you can see how it all works together and how you can go about finding the right colors for your home and get the right results, every single time. That's the goal here. And I think the best way to do that is to just look at some rooms, some specific rooms, and show you how the process works. So let's start with a bedroom. All right? So with a bedroom in mind, before you run to the paint store and start looking for colored chips and samples, first thing we've got to do is what we talked about last segment. You've got to decide what you want out of the space, right? That's the first step in all of these. Every interior design decision you make, the first step should always be deciding what kind of atmosphere you want to create. Now, for most of us, we're talking a bedroom here, so what we're looking for is a place to kind of recover from the day. That's what I'm after. I'm just after a place where I can recover from what I put myself through in the other 16 hours or whatever it is of my day. We're looking for a space in the home, probably the primary space where we want our nervous systems to wind down, to settle, eventually to go to sleep and just check out for a while. Sweet, blessed relief before we wake up and have to do all of this all over again. So with that atmosphere in mind, if that's what you're after in a bedroom, you're usually going to be better off leaning into softer, quieter color families. So think muted blues, gentle greens, warm off-whites, soft natural neutrals. In a bedroom, the goal is not to create a lot of visual activity. not a lot of visual excitement. It's to create a sense of ease and peace. And that usually is going to mean using lower saturation in your colors, lower contrast, and colors themselves that feel settled, not loud. So medium tones, they're ideal in a space like this. And then, choose those colors and let the lighting handle the coziness side of things. Warm bulbs and lamps, dimmed lighting, they can make the space feel inviting at night, while the wall color does the quieter work of keeping the room calm and visually gentle. In other words, you want the color palette to support rest, not compete with it. All right? That's the bedroom. Let's look at a kitchen. And a kitchen is going to be a completely different animal. It's usually a space for energy. We have got a lot of movement, a lot of engagement, a lot of conversation, appetite. All of those things are, feelings and, parts of the atmosphere we generally want to create in a kitchen. So with that in mind, warmer hues often make much more sense here because they tend to feel more active, more lively, more inviting. Remember, though, that brightness and saturation matter just as much as hue in this conversation that we're having. So in a kitchen, warm colors can be great, but if they get too bright or too saturated, the room can start to feel loud, busy, a little bit exhausting. So the better move is usually warmth with a little bit of restraint. So a softened yellow, a muted clay, a creamy off-white, or a warm earthy neutral. Often all of those colors are going to give you that liveliness that you want without overwhelming the space. What you're trying to do is let the kitchen feel warm and awake, but you don't want to turn the volume all the way up, right? Keep that saturation volume. Don't go to 11. Don't turn it up to 11. Keep it right around 4 or 5. What about living rooms? They're a little bit trickier because their purpose changes, from house to house, and honestly, from hour to hour to some extent, but for sure from house to house. If your living room is mainly a social space, a place for entertaining, for conversation, for family time, then warmer tones, they make a lot of sense because they tend to support connection and engagement. But if it's more of a wind-down space where you want to read, watch TV, or just decompress after work, then cooler, softer, more muted colors may serve you better. And again, it's not just about whether a color is warm or cool. Brightness and saturation, never forget that part of the conversation. A warm color that's too bright can feel restless. A cool color that's too dark or heavy can feel flat or closed off. Usually that sweet spot in a living room is going to be a color with some personality, but not too much volume. It doesn't have to be neutral, but it can lean in that regard. And the nice thing is, if you've got something that is somewhat neutral, you're going to be able to make that room a little more flexible. You can push the mood warmer or cooler through furniture and textiles and lighting without having to repaint the whole thing. I went too far. I pushed my room so that the color dominates the space. I can put all the throw pillows out that I want. It's not going to change the tone that I've created in that space. But you can choose a color in your living room that gives you the freedom to kind of move it a little bit and, throughout the day or based on your needs to flex a little bit. So a little more neutral might help you out there. All right, what about a home office? This honestly might be one of the more interesting rooms because what you need here is a specific balance. You want calm, but you also want alert. You don't want a room that makes you feel wired or distracted, but you also don't want one that makes you feel sleepy or checked out or disengaged. And that's why cooler, quieter tones often make a lot of sense in a workspace. Soft blues, muted greens, gentle grays, all of those can help create a sense of steadiness and focus without the agitation that warmer, louder colors can sometimes bring. So the sweet spot is usually something softened and a little bit restrained. So pale blue, muted sage, a dusty green, maybe a gray with just enough warmth to keep it from feeling sterile. Those are the kinds of colors that can support sustained thinking and concentration without making the room feel either tense or dull. Bathrooms, let's look at them and then we'll wrap this up. Bathrooms are a little bit unique too because for most of us, they're less about energy or focus and more about, refreshment. Not food, refreshment. Refreshing ourselves, being refreshed, not enjoying refreshments. Most of us don't enjoy a lot of refreshments in the bathroom. That's a little bit weird. In some homes, let's just move on. The bathroom is purely functional, right? It's a place to get in, to wake up, to get moving. However, in other homes, I think in most other homes, the bathroom can be one of the few spaces in the house that's meant to feel really, really quiet and private and restorative. I'm thinking you've got a bathtub there and somebody just wants to spend hours in that because it's their only time when the kids aren't hounding them, provided they can get that door locked and drawers pulled in front of it. Because the kids always pick those little locks. They can get those open, the bathroom locks. They can get through those like butter. But you open up that drawer right inside the door, can't get through that. Maybe some people go and use the bathrooms for those kinds of things, just to finally have some peace and quiet. Well, if that's the case, softer colors work really well here. Cool whites, gentle blue grays, muted greens, soft taupes, clean restrained tones. All of those will help a bathroom feel calm, fresh, and uncluttered. Now, at the same time, you don't want the room to feel cold and clinical, unless that's truly the look that you're after. After all, who doesn't want a cold and clinical space? That's pretty nice. I do love your bathroom. Reminds me of the lab in the hospital. And where do you keep the cotton balls? Where are those little gloves? Do you have those in the drawer here? If cold and clinical isn't your jam, then the sweet spot is usually a color that feels clean and light, but still has a little bit of softness or warmth in it. So pale green, a misty blue, a warm white, a light grayish, can do that really well. In a bathroom, you're usually aiming for some combination of calm, cleanliness, leaning heavily on the cleanliness maybe, and clarity, the chance to find clarity, to refocus your soul again before you have to go outside and face the world, but, largely just your family. You want the space to feel like a reset, not like another room that's asking something from your nervous system, just a place where you feel some peace. So keeping all of that in mind as you choose your colors is really important, because if you're not picking colors, they're going to lean towards that. It's not going to override the peace that you get out of just having some privacy in the bathroom. It's not going to completely override that, but it's going to be working against you. And that's really what all of this was all about all along, is trying to work away or get away from anything in your home, color-wise or design-wise, that's working against what you're trying to achieve. Right? The rest of the world is already working against us on a regular basis. It would be nice to know that our home itself is working with us, with our nervous system towards our greater goals. That was my point in all of this. I started off weeks ago with a single question that I still think is really important. What does it mean to feel at home? Feeling at home is a phrase that we use all the time. We use it all the time. We talk about making a house a home. What are we chasing when we try to do that? What are we talking about when we say we want to make a house a home? What makes your house feel like your home? We all have that idea of what that is for us. And maybe you can't pin it down and verbalize it, but the feelings are there. You know what home feels like or should feel like. And you know if your home is doing that for you. And I'd bet that most of us, most of our homes are succeeding at this. There's a level of comfort that we have just being in our own space, warts and all. It's ours. We can use the bathroom here without any concern. As long as we can get that drawer out and the kids can't get in, we can use the bathroom there. Nobody's going to, I'll move on. It's home. But maybe within your home, there are parts or spaces that don't produce the same feelings, the same calm or peace or hominess. I don't know what the right word is. I've got areas like that in my home. Largely the home does a good job. There are areas where it's just not producing that same calm, that same peace, that same atmosphere that I'm shooting for. And I've tried to figure out what's not working in those rooms, and I've never really been sure. The colors are good colors, the furniture's arranged well, everything should be good, but it still feels a little bit off. Maybe you've got areas like that too. And that's what all of this was about, helping you find those areas and seeing that there's something else going on beneath the surface that could be impacting how you feel in your home. Our brains, our nervous systems, they're constantly reading the spaces that we move through. And if little things are off, they just won't relax and settle and rest. We won't feel right. We'll be nagged, by some lurking feeling that sometimes we can't even name. We can't stop this system. We can't turn it off. We don't even have to, really notice that it's happening, but it's there. So That's what this was about. Be aware of that. Be aware of that reality and make your design decisions with that in mind. And remember, when it comes to anything color related, we've got color consultants at each RepcoLite location who will gladly help you with any question you've got. Come in with photos, come in with samples, and talk to us. We want you to find a color that you love, and we'll work with you until you find it. I've said it before, we talked about it on the show, but we believe this wholeheartedly. You can have the best paint on your wall, and you can apply it with the skill of an 18th century artisan. It can be immaculate and perfect and beautiful. It can be tough. It can resist scuffs and wear. It can clean up like a dream. It can be the best in terms of quality and craftsmanship. But if you don't like the color, it's still a complete loss. Color is the top dog. You got to get the color right. We'll help. Stop out at any RepcoLite location and start the conversation. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to find it again, you can find it online at RepcoLite.com. Whatever you do today, make sure paint's a part of it. Have a great weekend, everybody, and I'll see you next time. I'm Dan Hansen for Home in Progress. Thanks for listening.